Most people think the biggest advantage in life is intelligence. They think the people who build extraordinary things were born with something the rest of the world never received. A different brain, a different level of talent, a different set of opportunities. That's the story people tell themselves when they want to explain someone else's success without questioning their own choices. It's comfortable, convenient, and completely wrong, because if intelligence alone was enough, the smartest people in every room would always win. They don't. If talent alone was enough, every gifted person would become extraordinary. They don't. If opportunity alone was enough, every person born into the right circumstances would change the world. They don't. So, what separates the few from the many? I've spent years thinking about that question. Not because I was searching for motivation. Motivation is temporary. It disappears the moment reality becomes difficult. I was searching for something deeper, something structural, something that remains when excitement is gone. And eventually I realized something most people never notice. The difference isn't what successful people have, it's what they're willing to tolerate. Think about that for a second. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid discomfort. They avoid uncertainty. They avoid rejection. They avoid criticism. They avoid failure. They avoid situations that expose their weaknesses. And because they avoid those things, they also avoid growth. Because growth hides inside the very experiences people spend their lives escaping. That's the paradox. The thing you want most is usually hidden behind the thing you fear most. The confidence you want exists behind uncertainty. The success you want exists behind failure. The future you want exists behind risk. But people don't see it that way. They see uncertainty as a warning sign, a reason to stop, a reason to wait, a reason to remain exactly where they are. And that's why most lives never change. Not because people lack potential, because they misinterpret discomfort. They think discomfort means something is wrong, when often it means something important is happening. Look at the way most people make decisions. They constantly ask themselves one question. What if this doesn't work? It sounds reasonable, intelligent, even, but hidden inside that question is an assumption. The assumption that failure is the worst possible outcome. It isn't. The worst outcome isn't failure. The worst outcome is becoming the type of person who never discovers what they're capable of, because they spent their entire life protecting themselves from discomfort. That's a far greater loss. And the frightening part is that most people don't even realize it's happening, because stagnation is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives gradually. One postponed decision, one delayed opportunity, one excuse, one compromise, one comfortable choice after another, until years pass and nothing changes, not because life was unfair, not because success was impossible, but because comfort slowly became more important than growth. That's how dreams disappear. Not dramatically, quietly. Most people imagine failure as a sudden event. It usually isn't. Failure is often a pattern, a collection of small decisions repeated over time. The decision to wait, the decision to avoid, the decision to remain safe, the decision to postpone action until certainty arrives. But certainty never arrives. That's the part nobody tells you. There is no moment where life suddenly provides complete reassurance. There is no day when all risk disappears. No future where every question has an answer. No version of reality where uncertainty stops existing. The people who move forward understand that. The people who stay behind spend years fighting it. And that's where the separation begins. Not in intelligence, not in talent, not in resources, in perception. Two people can look at the exact same situation and see completely different realities. One sees danger, the other sees possibility. One sees risk, the other sees opportunity. One sees reasons to stop, the other sees reasons to continue. The situation doesn't change, the interpretation does. And interpretation determines action. Action determines results. Results determine reality, which means reality often begins as perception. That's why mindset matters far more than people realize. Not because positive thinking magically creates success. It doesn't. Reality doesn't care about affirmations. Reality responds to action, but mindset determines whether action happens in the first place. And most people have never learned how deeply their perception controls their future. They believe they're responding to reality. Often they're responding to their interpretation of reality. There's a difference, a massive one. Imagine two people standing in front of the same impossible challenge. The first person immediately begins calculating reasons it won't work. The obstacles, the limitations, the risks, the potential embarrassment, the probability of failure. The second person sees all the same obstacles, but asks a different question. What would need to be true for this to work? Notice the difference. One mindset closes doors, the other searches for keys. One protects, the other explores. One remains trapped inside current reality, the other begins creating a future reality. That's not motivation. That's architecture, the architecture of thought. And everything in your life eventually becomes a reflection of it. The frightening thing is that most people never consciously design that architecture. They inherit it from parents, from schools, from environments, from people who were never trying to build something extraordinary themselves. And then they wonder why their thinking feels limited, why their ambitions feel smaller than they should, why every dream seems unrealistic before it even begins, because the mind adapts to the environment that surrounds it. If everyone around you believes something is impossible, eventually that belief starts feeling like reality, even when it isn't. History is filled with examples. Ideas that were called impossible, technologies that were dismissed, people who were underestimated, dreams that seemed absurd, until they became reality. Then suddenly everyone acts like the outcome was obvious. But it wasn't obvious. It never is. That's why breakthroughs are rare. They require someone willing to believe in a future that doesn't yet exist. Someone willing to continue when evidence is incomplete. Someone willing to move before certainty arrives. Most people can't do that. Not because they're incapable, because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. And discomfort triggers resistance. The mind wants familiarity, predictability, control. But extraordinary outcomes rarely emerge from familiar paths. They emerge from unknown territory. That's why the future belongs to people who can tolerate uncertainty longer than everyone else. People think courage means not being afraid. That's never been true. Courage is continuing despite fear, moving despite doubt, acting despite uncertainty. And the people who understand that gain an advantage that compounds over time, because while everyone else waits for confidence, they're building experience. While everyone else waits for permission, they're creating momentum. While everyone else waits for guarantees, they're learning, improving, adapting, growing. And eventually the gap becomes impossible to ignore. From the outside it looks like success happened suddenly. It didn't. It happened slowly, quickly, one uncomfortable decision at a time, one risk at a time. One moment of courage repeated again and again until it became identity. Because that's what people miss. Successes isn't something you achieve. It's something you become. Before the results appear externally, something changes internally. The way you think, the way you respond, the way you interpret reality, the way you approach problems, the way you handle uncertainty, the way you move through fear. That's where transformation begins. Not in outcomes, in identity. And once identity changes, everything else starts following it. Most people try to change results without changing identity. That's why they remain stuck. They want different outcomes while remaining the same person. But reality doesn't work that way. A different future requires a different version of you. A version willing to tolerate what others avoid. A version willing to think differently, acts differently, Persist differently. A version willing to continue when progress is invisible, because progress is often invisible in the beginning. That's another truth people struggle to accept. The most important growth happens long before anyone notices, long before recognition, long before success, long before evidence appears. And if you need immediate proof before continuing, you'll quit before transformation has time to occur. That's why patience is so rare and so valuable, because patience isn't passive. Patience is sustained belief in the absence of visible results, and very few people possess it. They want immediate confirmation, immediate validation, immediate rewards. But reality doesn't operate on immediate timelines. The strongest foundations are built slowly. The biggest changes happen gradually. And the people who understand that eventually gain something powerful, an advantage that can't be copied. Because while everyone else becomes distracted by short-term outcomes, they remain focused on long-term transformation. And long-term transformation changes everything. Most people never notice the moment they surrender. Not because it's dramatic, not because it changes everything overnight, but because it happens quietly, so quietly that they mistake it for maturity, for realism, for wisdom. They tell themselves they're being practical, that they're lowering expectations, being reasonable, accepting reality. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening is something far more dangerous. They're shrinking, not externally, internally. The version of themselves that once believed anything was possible begins disappearing, slowly, piece by piece, until one day they no longer recognize what they've lost. And the strange thing is, they often call that process growth. They call it growing up, becoming realistic, learning how the world works. But every extraordinary achievement in human history required someone willing to reject the limits everyone else accepted, someone willing to look irrational, someone willing to continue believing after everyone around them stopped. That's the uncomfortable truth. The people who change the world are often the people least interested in accepting its limitations. Because limitations are strange, most of them aren't real. They're inherited, passed from one person to another, one generation to the next, one mind to another, until eventually nobody remembers where they came from, only that they exist. And because they exist, people obey them, without questioning them, without examining them, without asking the question that changes everything. What if this isn't true? That question is dangerous. Not because it creates chaos, because it creates freedom. The moment you begin questioning assumptions, you stop living inside someone else's reality. You start building your own. And that's where things become interesting. Because most people don't actually want freedom. They think they do, but freedom comes with responsibility. Responsibility comes with risk. And risk means there's nobody left to blame, no system, no circumstance, no environment, no excuse, just you. And that's a level of accountability most people spend their lives avoiding, because accountability is heavy. It removes every place you can hide, every story you tell yourself, every explanation that protects you from uncomfortable truths. It forces you to confront reality directly. And reality can be brutal. It can show you exactly where you're holding yourself back, exactly where you're settling, exactly where fear is making decisions on your behalf. Most people don't want to see that. They'd rather remain distracted, because distraction feels easier than self-confrontation. Look around. The modern world is built on distraction, infinite entertainment, infinite noise, infinite stimulation, always something to watch, something to scroll, something to consume, and none of it is accidental, because a distracted mind never asks difficult questions. A distracted mind never examines itself. A distracted mind never discovers its full potential. It remains occupied, bussy, comfortable, and comfort is profitable. That's why so many people spend years consuming things they never use, information, advice, motivation, ideas, endless streams of content, always learning, rarely acting. Because action is where consequences begin. Action exposes reality, reality reveals weaknesses, and weakness is uncomfortable, so people stay in preparation mode forever, waiting, learning, planning, thinking, analyzing, researching, anything except moving, anything except testing themselves against reality. But reality is the only teacher that matters, not because knowledge is useless, because knowledge without action remains theoretical. And theory has never changed a life. Application does, execution does, experience does. The person who reads 1,000 books about courage and never takes a risk learns less than the person who takes one meaningful risk and pays attention to what happens. Reality teaches faster. Reality teaches deeper. Reality leaves marks. And those marks become wisdom. That's another thing people misunderstand. Wisdom isn't information, it's transformation. It's what happens when experience changes the way you see the world. And transformation requires friction. Without friction, nothing changes. Without resistance, nothing grows. Without pressure, nothing evolves. Nature understands this. Muscles grow through resistance. Diamonds form through pressure. Strength develops through challenge. Yet human beings constantly search for a life without friction, a life without difficulty, a life without struggle, not realizing they're searching for the very conditions that prevent growth. The irony is almost painful. People want extraordinary lives, but ordinary levels of discomfort, extraordinary results, but average levels of sacrifice, massive success, but minimal uncertainty. Reality doesn't negotiate like that. Every reward has a price. Every opportunity carries responsibility. Every breakthrough demands something in return. Time, energy, focus, Debat Spincent. The question has never been whether the price exists. The question is whether you're willing to pay it, because somebody always pays. Some people pay the price of discipline. Others pay the price of regret. Some people pay through effort. Others pay through missed opportunities. But nobody escapes payment. That's the illusion. People think avoiding difficulty means avoiding cost. It doesn't. It simply changes the cost, and often the delayed cost is far greater. Years later, people look back and wonder what happened, where the time went, why life feels smaller than it once did, why possibility feels distant, why excitement disappeared. But the answer is usually simple. They stopped challenging themselves. They stopped moving toward uncertainty. They stopped expanding. And the mind reflects whatever pattern it repeats. If you repeatedly choose comfort, comfort becomes identity. If you repeatedly choose growth, growth becomes identity. Identity is built through repetition, not intention, not desire, not wishes. Repetition. That's why habits matter, not because habits are magical, because habits become evidence, evidence becomes belief, belief becomes identity, and identity shapes destiny. Most people wait until they believe in themselves before taking action. They have it backwards. Belief comes after action. Confidence comes after evidence. Evidence comes after repetition. Everything starts with movement, not certainty. Movement, a small action repeated consistently, becomes something powerful. Because momentum has a strange effect on human beings. Once momentum begins, resistance weakens, fear becomes quieter, doubt loses authority. Things that once felt impossible start feeling achievable. Not because reality changed, because you changed. That's what people miss. The biggest transformation isn't external, it's perceptual. The world begins looking different because you're looking at it differently. Problems become puzzles. Obstacles become information. Failure becomes feedback. Difficulty becomes training. And once that shift occurs, there's no going back to the old way of thinking, because you've seen something. You've seen that growth isn't something you find, it's something you create, one decision at a time, one challenge at a time, one uncomfortable choice at a time. And eventually those choices compound. They build something invisible, something deeper than success, deeper than deeper than achievement, deeper than recognition. They build character, and character is what remains when everything else disappears. Money can vanish, Dottie can disappear, opportunities can change, but character stays. The ability to continue, the ability to adapt, the ability to endure, the ability to remain focused when circumstances become difficult. That's what separates people who collapse under pressure from people who grow stronger because of it. Pressure doesn't create character. Pressure reveals it. And once it's revealed, you finally see who you've been becoming all along. That's why every challenge matters. Not because challenges are enjoyable, because they're revealing. They show you things comfort never could. They expose hidden weaknesses, strengths, potential, parts of yourself that remain invisible until difficulty forces them into view. And what if that's the real purpose of struggle? Not to stop you, not to punish you, but to introduce you to a version of yourself you've never met before, a version stronger than you imagined, more resilient than you believed, more capable than you've ever allowed yourself to become. Most people never meet that version, not because it doesn't exist, because they turn around too early, right before the transformation begins, right before the breakthrough, right before reality starts responding differently. And that's the tragedy. Not failure, not mistakes, not setbacks. The tragedy is leaving before discovering how far you could have gone. Because potential means nothing by itself. Potential is common. Realized potential is rare. And the distance between those two things is measured by one question. When things become difficult, do you stop or do you continue? Because everything changes based on that answer. There comes a moment in every person's life when the excuses stop sounding convincing, not to other people, to themselves. That's the moment everything changes. Because as long as you believe your own excuses, growth remains impossible. You can blame circumstances, you can blame timing, you can blame luck, you can blame the economy, your upbringing, your environment, the people around you. And sometimes those things matter. Sometimes they matter more than people realize. But eventually, a different question appears, a question that refuses to disappear. What am I going to do about it? That's the question that separates observers from builders. Because observers spend their lives explaining reality, builders spend their lives changing it. And changing reality requires something most people avoid: responsibility. Not the kind forced onto you by other people, the deeper kind, the kind where you stop waiting for rescue, stop waiting for ideal conditions, stop waiting for permission, and accept that your future belongs to you. That realization is terrifying, because once you accept responsibility, you lose your excuses. There's nowhere left to hide, no story left to protect you. Only decisions, only actions, only consequences. Most people spend years avoiding that moment because avoiding responsibility feels easier for a while. But avoidance has a cost. Every day you avoid responsibility, you hand control of your future to circumstances. You become reactive instead of intentional. You begin drifting. And drifting is dangerous. Not because it feels dangerous, because it doesn't. That's what makes it so deceptive. Drifting feels normal, comfortable, safe. Days pass, weeks pass, months pass. Nothing dramatic happens, nothing alarming, nothing urgent. Until one day you look around and realize you've become a passenger in your own life, living according to habits you never chose, following routines you never questioned, pursuing goals you never consciously selected. That's what happens when awareness disappears. Life starts happening automatically. And automatic lives rarely become extraordinary. Extraordinary lives are built deliberately. They're designed, constructed, refined, not left to chance. That's why awareness is so powerful. Because awareness interrupts autopilot. It forces you to notice things, patterns, habits, thoughts, behaviors, beliefs, And once you notice something clearly, you can't completely ignore it anymore. That's both a gift and a burden, because awareness creates responsibility. The moment you see what's holding you back, you become responsible for addressing it. The moment you recognize a weakness, you become responsible for improving it. The moment you identify wasted potential, you become responsible for deciding whether you'll continue wasting it. Most people don't want that responsibility because responsibility demands action, and action creates uncertainty. We're back to the same thing again, uncertainty, the invisible force behind so many human decisions. It's remarkable when you think about it. How many dreams disappear because someone couldn't tolerate uncertainty? How many opportunities are lost because someone needed guarantees? How many futures never happen because someone was waiting to feel ready? Ready. That's one of the most dangerous words in existence, because it sounds intelligent, responsible, mature, but often it's just fear wearing a more acceptable disguise. People tell themselves they're waiting until they're ready, but what they're really waiting for is certainty, and certainty never arrives. Not before the first step, not before the leap, not before the risk. Readiness isn't something you discover. It's something you develop through action, through repetition, through experience. Nobody feels fully prepared before doing something difficult. Nobody. The people who appear confident now were uncertain once. The people who appear fearless now felt fear once. The people who seem unstoppable now doubted themselves once. The difference is they moved anyway, and movement changed them. That's how growth works. Not through thinking, through doing. Thinking matters. Planning matters. Strategy matters. But eventually every meaningful transformation requires action. Without action, nothing changes. The mind remains full of possibilities, but reality remains unchanged. And reality only responds to action. That's why execution is so rare, not because it's complicated, because it's revealing. Execution exposes the truth. Whether your idea works, whether your strategy is effective, whether your assumptions are accurate, whether your preparation was useful, action removes illusion. And illusion can be comforting, reality often isn't. That's why so many people remain stuck in preparation mode. Preparing feels productive. Planning feels productive. Researching feels productive. But none of those things guarantee movement. And movement is what matters. Imagine standing at the edge of a massive ocean. You can spend years studying the water, reading about it, analyzing it, understanding it. But eventually you have to step in. Otherwise, all your knowledge remains theoretical. Life works the same way. At some point, you have to enter the water. At some point, you have to risk failure. At some point, you have to accept uncertainty. Because uncertainty isn't the enemy, it's the entry fee, the cost of admission into a larger life. Every meaningful opportunity requires it. Every meaningful relationship requires it. Every meaningful achievement requires it. You don't eliminate uncertainty, you learn to carry it. That's what strength really is. Not the absence of fear, the ability to move while fear exists. Not the absence of doubt, the ability to continue while doubt exists. Not the absence of uncertainty, the ability to build despite uncertainty. And that ability becomes incredibly powerful over time, because most people never develop it. They spend their lives waiting for emotional certainty before taking action, which means their emotions become their limitations. Think about that. How many people allow temporary feelings to dictate permanent outcomes? How many opportunities disappear because confidence wasn't present at the exact moment action was required? How many futures vanish because fear was temporarily louder than ambition? More than anyone realizes. That's why emotional control matters. Not suppressing emotions, understanding them, recognizing them, refusing to allow them complete authority over your decisions, because emotions are information, not instructions. Fear can inform you. It shouldn't control you. Doubt can inform you. It shouldn't define you. Anxiety can inform you. It shouldn't determine your future. The moment you understand that, you become harder to stop. Because suddenly, you're no longer waiting to feel perfect. You're no longer waiting for ideal conditions. You're no longer waiting for confidence. You're acting despite imperfection, despite uncertainty, despite fear. And that's where momentum begins. Momentum is one of the most misunderstood forces in human life. People think motivation creates momentum. Often it's the opposite. Momentum creates motivation, action creates momentum, progress creates momentum, movement creates momentum. And once momentum begins, something interesting happens. The impossible starts looking possible. The overwhelming starts looking manageable. The distant starts looking reachable. Not because reality changed overnight, because perspective changed. Progress changes perspective. That's why even small actions matter. Small actions create evidence. Evidence creates belief. Belief creates confidence. Confidence creates larger action. And larger action creates bigger opportunities. Everything builds on itself. Everything compounds. That's how transformation works, not through one dramatic moment, through thousands of small moments, thousands of choices, thousands of actions, repeated consistently over time. Most people underestimate that process because it's invisible. They want immediate results, immediate proof, immediate rewards. But the most powerful changes are often invisible at first. The roots grow before the tree appears. The foundation is built before the structure rises. The identity changes before the results arrive. That's why patience matters. Because patience allows invisible growth to become visible. Without patience, people quit too early, right before progress becomes obvious, right before momentum becomes undeniable, right before the future starts reflecting the effort invested into it. And that's where so many people lose. Not because they lack ability, because they abandon the process too soon. They leave before the transformation finishes. They stop before the momentum compounds. They quit before reality catches up. And reality always catches up, eventually. The question is whether you'll still be moving when it does. Because if you are, everything changes. Not instantly, not magically, but permanently. And permanent change is worth waiting for. Eventually, everything comes down to a single decision. Not the decision everyone sees. Not the public one. Not the dramatic moment that gets remembered later. The private one. The silent one. The decision that happens when nobody is watching. The decision to continue. Because if you've made it this far, you've probably realized something. Success isn't mysterious. It's not hidden. It's not reserved for a special group of people. The principles are visible. The path exists. The information is available. And yet most people still don't reach their potential. Why? Because knowing has never been the problem. Becoming is. Knowing what to do is easy. Becoming the type of person who actually does it consistently, that's difficult. That's where resistance appears. That's where excuses multiply. That's where comfort starts negotiating. And comfort is a convincing negotiator. It never tells you to quit. That would be obvious. Instead, it suggests waiting, retting delaying, starting tomorrow, thinking about it a little longer, making one more plan, gathering one more piece of information, until eventually weeks become months, months become years, and years become a life that looks nothing like the one you imagined. Not because you failed, because you delayed. People underestimate the cost of delay. They think time is neutral. It isn't. Time compounds. Everything compounds. Your habits compound. Your mindset compounds. Your discipline compounds. Your excuses compound. Even avoidance compounds. Every action pushes you somewhere. Every inaction pushes you somewhere too. That's what makes life so unforgiving. You don't get to remain still. You either move toward growth or away from it, toward possibility or away from it, toward the person you're capable of becoming or away from that person every single day. Whether you notice it or not, that's why awareness matters so much, because awareness allows you to see the direction you're actually moving, not the direction you claim to be moving, not the direction you intend to move someday, the direction your actions reveal. Actions don't lie, intentions do, words do, plans do, socks don't. Socks expose priorities, they expose commitment, they expose truth, and truth is often uncomfortable, because the truth forces us to confront the gap between who we are and who we could become. Most people spend their lives avoiding that gap, not because they're lazy, because the gap hurts. It reveals unrealized potential, unfulfilled promises, unattempted dreams. It shows you everything you could have become if fear hadn't been making decisions for you. That's difficult to face. But it's also necessary, because transformation begins the moment honesty becomes stronger than comfort, the moment you stop protecting your limitations, the moment you stop defending your excuses, the moment you stop explaining why things can't happen, and start asking what would happen if they did. That's where everything shifts. Because the future has always belonged to people willing to believe in possibilities before evidence exists, not blindly, not irrationally, but courageously. The ability to hold a vision while reality hasn't caught up yet. That's rare, and rarity creates value. Look around. Most people don't have a vision. They have reactions. They respond to circumstances, respond to problems, respond to events, respond to pressure. But visionaries operate differently. They create direction, and direction changes everything. Because direction determines where effort goes. Without direction, effort becomes scattered. Without direction, energy gets wasted. Without direction, potential never organizes itself into something meaningful. That's why vision matters. Not because it predicts the future, because it creates one. A clear vision gives struggle meaning, it gives sacrifice meaning, it gives discipline meaning. Without vision, difficulty feels pointless. With vision, difficulty becomes necessary, and necessary difficulty is easier to endure than meaningless difficulty. That's something few people understand. Human beings can survive enormous hardship when hardship serves a purpose. What destroys people isn't difficulty, it's meaninglessness, feeling disconnected from a future worth pursuing, feeling disconnected from a reason to continue, feeling disconnected from purpose. Purpose changes everything. Purpose creates endurance. Purpose creates resilience. Purpose creates persistence. Because purpose answers the question that appears when motivation disappears. Why continue? Why keep building? Why keep trying? Why keep moving? Without purpose, there is no answer. With purpose, there always is. And purpose doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to involve changing the world. It only has to matter deeply enough that quitting becomes harder than continuing. That's enough. That's where obsession begins. Not unhealthy obsession, focused obsession, the kind that keeps moving when excitement fades, the kind that remains after applause disappears, the kind that survives failure. Because every extraordinary achievement requires a period where nobody understands what you're doing, nobody sees the vision, nobody sees the future, nobody sees the outcome. Only you do. And during that period, belief becomes essential. Not belief in guarantees, belief in possibility, belief in growth, belief in the process, belief that effort invested today can create a future that doesn't exist yet. That's not fantasy, that's construction. Every meaningful future is built twice. First in the mind, then in reality. The problem is most people stop after the first stage. They imagine, they dream, they visualize. But they never build. Because building is difficult. Building demands consistency. Building demands patience. Building demands sacrifice. And sacrifice is becoming increasingly rare. Everyone wants extraordinary outcomes. Few people want extraordinary responsibility. Everyone wants the reward. Few people want the burden attached to it. But the burden is where transformation happens. The burden creates strength. The burden creates wisdom. The burden creates capability. Without burden, potential remains dormant, untested, unproven, unrealized. That's why difficult seasons matter. Not because suffering is noble, because challenge reveals capacity. You don't know how resilient you are until resilience becomes necessary. You don't know how disciplined you are until discipline becomes necessary. You don't know how committed you are until commitment becomes expensive. Pressure reveals truth. Always. And truth creates clarity. Clarity creates decisions. Decisions create direction. Derek creates destiny. Everything connects. Everything compounds. Everything matters. That's why the smallest actions often carry the biggest consequences. A single decision repeated daily becomes a habit. A habit repeated long enough becomes identity. Identity repeated long enough becomes a life. And lives are built exactly this way. Not through dramatic moments, through repeated choices. Quiet choices, invisible choices. The choices nobody celebrates. The choices nobody notices. The choices that happen when nobody is watching. That's where greatness begins. Not in public, in private, not in recognition, in repetition, not in achievement, in discipline. Because discipline is what remains when everything else disappears. When motivation leaves, when confidence fades, when progress slows, when uncertainty grows, discipline remains. And, eventually, discipline becomes freedom. Which sounds impossible until you experience it. People think freedom comes from doing whatever you want. Real freedom comes from controlling yourself, controlling your attention, controlling your habits, controlling your impulses, controlling your reactions, because a person who cannot control themselves will always be controlled by something else. Fear, comfort, distraction, approval, circumstances. Something will take control. The question is whether you choose what it is. That's why self-mastery matters. Not because it makes life easier, because it makes life yours. And ownership changes everything. The moment you stop waiting for someone else to save you, your power returns. The moment you stop waiting for perfect conditions, your momentum returns. The moment you stop negotiating with fear, your future changes, not immediately, but inevitably, because every decision starts creating consequences. Every action starts building evidence. Every day starts shaping identity, and identity eventually shapes destiny. That's how transformation works. Quietly, gradually, relentlessly, until one day you look back and realize something remarkable. You became the person you once needed, the person you once admired, the person you once thought was beyond your reach, not because of one moment, not because of one breakthrough, not because of one opportunity, but because you continued, again, and again, and again. When it would have been easier to stop, when it would have been easier to quit, when it would have been easier to settle, you continued, and eventually reality responded, because reality always responds to consistency. It may respond slowly, but it responds. The future is listening, every day, every choice, every habit, every action. The future is taking notes, recording who you're becoming, not who you say you are, who you're becoming, and one day you'll meet that person, the version of you created by every decision you've made, the version built through discipline or distraction, through courage or avoidance, through growth or comfort. And when that day arrives, there will be only one question that matters. Did you become everything you were capable of becoming? Or did you spend your life negotiating with your potential? Because potential is temporary. Opportunity is temporary. Time is temporary. But the consequences of how you use them, those last forever. So stop waiting. Stop explaining. Stop delaying. Stop asking whether the future is possible. Start building it. Because the people who change their lives aren't the people who know the most. They aren't the people who have the most. They aren't the people who wait the longest. They're the people who decide, the people who act, the people who continue, long after everyone else stops. And if there's one truth worth remembering above all others, It's this: the life you're searching for isn't waiting somewhere ahead of you. It's being created by what you choose to do next.